The twin Allison engines screamed as Major Richard Bung pushed the throttles forward. At 22,000 feet above Leyte Gulf, the temperature inside the cockpit was freezing, but sweat already soaked through his flight suit. Through the gun sight, he counted them. Dozens of dark shapes against the morning clouds. Too many to fight. Too many to run from. His ammunition counter read full. 2,000 rounds of .50 caliber, 150 shells of 20mm cannon fire. In 47 minutes, it would read empty. Between those two numbers lies one of World War II's greatest unsolved mysteries. 1 American pilot, 40 enemy aircraft, a single morning that rewrote the rules of what was possible in the sky. How does a man achieve the impossible when every instinct screams survival? And why would the military bury the greatest air combat achievement in history? Welcome to Hidden Fictions of World War II. Please subscribe to follow more untold stories from history's greatest conflict. Richard Ira Bong grew up hunting ducks over the frozen lakes of Wisconsin. His father taught him to lead a moving target, to fire in short, controlled bursts, to never waste ammunition. Those lessons, learned with a shotgun at age 12, would save his life in the skies over the Pacific. He wasn't a natural pilot. His instructors at Luke Field noted he was adequate but unexceptional in basic training. But he had something rare: the ability to stay calm when everyone else panicked. When other cadets froze during emergency procedures, Bung simply worked the problem. Methodical, precise, unhurried. By October 1944, that farm boy had become America's deadliest fighter ace. Flying a P-38 Lightning nicknamed Marge after his fiancée Marjorie Vattendahl back in Superior, Wisconsin, Bung had officially downed 35 Japanese aircraft. He was already famous. War correspondents followed him. Newsreels featured his drawling voice and shy smile. He was the clean-cut hero America needed. The P-38 Lightning was unlike anything else in the sky. Twin engines mounted on twin booms, connected by a central nacelle where the pilot sat surrounded by devastating firepower. 4 Browning .50 caliber machine guns and 1 Hispano 20mm cannon. All nose-mounted, all firing forward in a concentrated stream. No need to account for propeller arc, just point and shoot. The Lightning was fast, over 400 miles per hour in a dive. It had range, enough to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still make it home. And it had altitude. Its twin turbocharged engines could climb above most Japanese fighters. But it was complex, temperamental in tropical heat, and unforgiving of mistakes. Pilots called it the fork-tailed devil. Japanese pilots had another name for it. 2 planes, 1 pilot. Bung's Lightning carried a photograph of Marge on the instrument panel. Mechanics had painted her image on the nose, a blonde woman in a red dress, smiling. Bung touched the photo before every mission. He'd promised to come home. He'd promised to marry her when the war ended. October 24th, 1944. The date matters because of where Bung was and what was happening around him. General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippines 3 days earlier, waiting ashore at Leyte with newsreel cameras capturing his promise. "I have returned." It was propaganda, but it was also strategy. Retaking the Philippines would cut Japan's supply lines to Southeast Asia, the oil, rubber, and metals that kept their war machine alive. Japanese knew this. They threw everything they had at Leyte Gulf. The Imperial Japanese Navy committed virtually its entire remaining surface fleet. 4 separate task forces converged on the American landing beaches, hoping to destroy the invasion fleet before it could establish a foothold. What unfolded was the largest naval battle in human history. Over 200,000 men fought across 100,000 square miles of ocean, battleships firing salvos that could be heard for 30 miles, carriers launching aircraft by the hundreds, destroyers making suicidal torpedo runs against superior forces. And above it all, in the air, the final struggle for control of the Philippine skies. Tacloban Airfield, where Bung was stationed, was barely an airfield. Engineers had bulldozed a strip out of a muddy rice paddy 4 days earlier. Steel matting covered the worst of it, but coral dust and mud still sprayed up behind every takeoff. Mechanics worked in the open, no hangars, no shelter. If Japanese bombers got through, they'd catch American aircraft lined up like targets in a shooting gallery. The strategic situation was desperate. American carriers were still at sea, dealing with the Japanese surface fleet. Land-based air cover was thin, just a few dozen fighters at primitive airfields like Tacloban. If the Japanese could gain air superiority, even temporarily, they could devastate the invasion fleet anchored in the Gulf. Thousands of American soldiers were packed onto transport ships, defenseless against air attack. Everything depended on the fighters getting up in time. Timeline of key events. October 23, 1944. The night before. The evening briefing at Tacloban was tense. Intelligence officers spread maps across a folding table under the wing of a C-47 transport. Major Thomas McGuire, Bung's closest rival for the title of top ace, studied the charts with characteristic intensity. "They're going to hit us hard tomorrow," the intelligence officer said, pointing at red markers on the map. "Radio intercepts indicate major air groups forming up at Clark Field and Nichols Field. Could be 100 planes or more." Bong listened quietly. He rarely spoke in briefings unless asked a direct question. Other pilots knew him as focused but not flashy, confident but not cocky. Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Johnson, the squadron operations officer, later wrote in his diary, "Dick just nodded, asked what altitude we'd intercept at, then left to write his letter. Same routine every night." That letter-writing ritual was sacred. Before every combat mission, Bong wrote to Marge. He sealed each letter, dated it, and left it with the chaplain. If he didn't return, at least she'd have his words. The letter from October 23rd survives in the Bong family collection. Most of it is mundane, descriptions of the weather, the food, how much he missed Wisconsin. But the final paragraph reads, "Tomorrow looks like it'll be busy. Don't worry about me, honey. I've got the best plane and the best ground crew in the Pacific. I'll be home before you know it." The sun set over Leyte Gulf in bands of orange and purple. Mechanics worked through the night doing final checks on the P-38s. Staff Sergeant Kish, Bong's crew chief, replaced a bulky fuel pump and test-fired all 5 guns. "Marge was ready," Kish said in a 1983 interview. "She always was, but that night I checked everything twice. Something felt different." October 24th. Pre-dawn. 0500 hours. Reveille came at 0500 hours. Bung woke in a tent that smelled of mildew and mosquito netting. He dressed in the dark. Olive drab flight suit, leather jacket, boots worn soft from months of wear. His .45 caliber pistol went into the shoulder holster, knife strapped to his calf. In the Pacific, if you went down over water or jungle, you needed every advantage. The mess tent served powdered eggs and coffee strong enough to dissolve the spoon. Bung ate mechanically, forcing fuel into his body. Pilots learned early not to fly on an empty stomach. Combat maneuvers and G-forces did terrible things to digestion. But eating when adrenaline already had your stomach in knots was its own kind of torture. 0545 hours. The field telephone jangled in the operations tent. The duty officer grabbed it, listened for 10 seconds, then started shouting, "Scramble, scramble, all aircraft, bogies inbound from the north, get up there fast." 50 plus. Bung felt his heartbeat accelerate despite himself. In the back of his mind, he ran the math. 12 American fighters scrambling. 50 enemy aircraft. Not impossible odds, but not good ones.
At 10,000 feet, he pulled the oxygen mask over his face and clicked it into place. The air smelled of rubber and stale breath. At 15,000 feet, his hands started to get cold despite the leather gloves. At 20,000 feet, frost formed on the inside of the canopy. 0703 hours, first contact. Lieutenant Champlin's voice cut through the radio static. Tally-ho, 11 o'clock high. Jesus Christ, there's a lot of 'em. Bong looked left and up. At first, he saw nothing but clouds. Then the clouds moved. Except they weren't clouds. They were aircraft, dozens of them strung across the sky in a loose formation that stretched for miles. He recognized the silhouettes instantly. Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, the twin-engine medium bombers that had terrorized American shipping early in the war. Maybe 20 of them in 3 Vs, and around them, above them, weaving through the formation like protective sheepdogs, were the fighters. Zeros. Oscars. More than he could count in a glance. They were slightly above the American fighters, maybe 23,000 feet, heading south-southeast toward the Gulf, toward the invasion fleet. The American formation was still climbing, still trying to reach intercept altitude. Basic fighter tactics said you never attacked from below if you could help it. Altitude was life, altitude was energy, altitude was options. But there was no time to climb higher. Those bombers would reach the fleet in minutes. Major McGuire's voice crackled over the radio. Falcon leader to all flights. Climbing to intercept. Hit the bombers first. Ignore the fighters if you can. Sound tactics. Kill the bombers and you save the ships. Let the fighters escape and you still win. But Bong saw something McGuire didn't. The Japanese formation wasn't tight. The fighters were spread thin, trying to protect too many bombers with too few escorts. There was a gap, a vulnerable moment where the rear section of bombers had drifted behind the main formation and their fighter cover had followed the lead bombers. It was the kind of mistake green units made, and by late 1944, most Japanese units were green. The veteran pilots, the men who'd trained for years before the war, were dead. These were teenagers with maybe 60 hours of flight time, thrown into combat because Japan had no choice. Bong made a decision. He pushed the throttles to war emergency power and turned the stick hard left, breaking away from the formation. 0706 hours, the dive. Falcon 4 braking left, he said into the radio, his voice flat and calm despite the acceleration crushing him into his seat. The airframe started to shudder. The engine screamed. Bong trimmed for the dive, fine adjustments on the yoke to keep the shaking manageable. He was trading altitude for speed and speed for position. Physics and geometry merged into pure instinct. In 15 seconds, he covered nearly 2 miles and closed the distance to the Japanese formation from 3,000 feet to less than 500. At 500 feet behind the rear Betty bomber, Bong pulled out of the dive and leveled off directly astern. The bomber was huge in his gun sight, a dark green aircraft with a glassed-in nose and twin tail, engines trailing thin lines of exhaust. He could see the tail gunner swiveling his weapon, trying to track the P-38 that had appeared from nowhere. Bong's thumb found the gun trigger on his control yoke. Every instinct said squeeze it now, rake the bomber from tail to nose. But his father's voice echoed in his memory. Don't waste ammunition. He was close to 300 feet. Betty filled his entire field of vision. He could see rivets on the fuselage, see panels and hatches, see the tail gunner's face behind his weapon. At 200 feet, Bong fired. 0707 hours, first kill. All 5 guns erupted at once. The P-38 shuddered with recoil. Tracers, 1 in every 5 rounds, streaked across the gap in glowing lines, converging on the bomber's right engine. The sound was like tearing canvas, impossibly loud even over the engine noise. 2 seconds, that's all he gave it. 2 seconds of concentrated fire. Betty's right engine exploded in a blossom of orange flame. Pieces of cowling and propellers spun away into the slipstream. The bomber yawed right, the good engine pulling it into an uncontrollable bank. Smoke poured from the wing root, then secondary explosions, the fuel tanks igniting, the bomb load cooking off, and the entire aircraft came apart in midair. Bong hauled the stick right and rolled inverted, diving away from the fireball. Pieces of wreckage tumbled past his canopy, a wing panel, a seat, something that might have been a body. He didn't look. Looking got you killed. The second Betty in the formation was already reacting, the pilot banking left to escape. But the maneuver was panicked, uncoordinated. The bomber bled speed in the turn, hanging in the sky like a target on a practice range. Bong rolled upright, pulled into a climbing turn, and came around on the bomber's left side. Deflection shot, the hardest kind. The target moving one direction, you moving another, and you have to fire where the target will be, not where it is. But Bong had learned deflection shooting on ducks. His brain did the calculation automatically. Lead, altitude, closure rate. His thumb squeezed the trigger. 1 second burst. Tracers walked across the bomber's wing route and into the fuselage. The bomber nosed down, streaming fuel from punctured tanks. He didn't wait to see if it would burn. Already the Japanese fighters were reacting, rolling in to protect what remained of their bombers. Bong pushed the throttles forward and climbed, converting his speed back into altitude, looking for the next opening. 0709 hours. Into the chaos. What happened next is difficult to reconstruct with precision. Combat is chaos, three-dimensional, high speed, with multiple aircraft maneuvering violently in close proximity. Pilots experience time distortion. Radio communications are fragmented. And when survival depends on split-second decisions, no one is taking notes. But we can piece together the sequence from multiple sources. Bong's own brief debriefing notes, radio transcripts from that morning, witness statements from other pilots and from Navy personnel on ships below, and post-war analysis of Japanese records. The Japanese formation had disintegrated into a swirling furball. Bombers scattered in all directions, losing cohesion as pilots tried to escape. Fighters dove and climbed, trying to protect their charges while also engaging the attacking P-38s. And in the middle of it all, Richard Bong flew like a man possessed. Lieutenant Champlin, who entered the fight 30 seconds after Bong, later stated, "I saw Dick's lightning ahead of me, and everywhere he went, planes were exploding. I thought my eyes were playing tricks. I blinked, and another Jap bomber was on fire. Blinked again, and a Zero was spinning down trailing smoke. It was like watching a machine. No wasted motion, just target, fire, move. Target, fire, move." At 0711 hours, Seaman First Class Robert Martinez on the deck of USS Helm recorded in the ship's log, "Heavy air engagement bearing 340 degrees, range approximately 15 miles, multiple explosions observed." Splashes meant aircraft hitting the water. At 0713 hours, another entry, "Multiple explosions in air, at least 6 confirmed splashes. Single friendly fighter visible at base of engagement." A single friendly fighter. The other P-38s were still climbing into the fight, still trying to reach intercept altitude. 0715 hours, the grind begins. Ammunition management became critical. Bong had started the engagement with 2,000 rounds of 50 caliber and 150 rounds of 20 millimeter. Each trigger pull burned through ammunition at 15 rounds per second combined rate of fire. A 2-second burst consumed 30 rounds. Do that 60 times, and you're empty. So he fired in short, precise bursts. 1 second, 2 seconds maximum. Just enough to score hits, to damage engines or puncture fuel tanks or shattered cockpits. He didn't need to obliterate each target. He just needed to make them go away. Kill them, cripple them, or scare them enough that they turned for home. A Zero came at him head-on, tracers streaming from its cowling mounted guns. Bong jinked right, spoiling the Zero's aim. Then Snap rolled inverted and pulled through, coming around behind the Japanese fighter before its pilot even realized what had happened. 1 second burst into the Zero's engine. White smoke, then black. The Zero nosed down. Another Betty, this one trying to hide in a cloud bank, Bong followed it into the white, Flying on instruments, trusting his training, he emerged from the cloud 50 feet behind the bomber. The tail gunner was firing wildly, bullets stitching the air around Bong's canopy. Bong ignored it, centered the sight, and fired. The bomber shuddered under the impacts and fell away, trailing pieces. An Oscar, the Nakajima K-43 fighter, lighter and more maneuverable than the Zero, tried to turn with him. Bad decision. The P-38 might not turn as